will go high. Love, grace, humility will win. And then you tell everybody to go to hell. You think that's going to work for you, Coach White? Think that's going to work?
Stephanie White has been in this league for more than 2 decades. She's won a national championship as a player, a WNBA title as an assistant coach, and Coach of the Year honors running her own bench. This past week, her own fans booed her before tip-off. One post-game answer, given less than an hour after the final buzzer, turned the head coach of a first-place team into the most criticized person in the WNBA, almost overnight. By the time it was over, Stephen A. Smith had gone off on national television. DiJonai Carrington had fired back at a former NFL player over her own intelligence, and White herself had to stand up in front of her own crowd and answer for something she said before she'd even watched a replay. None of it started with a scandal. It started with a single fast break that lasted maybe 2 seconds. It started as a normal road game. Indiana Fever at the Chicago Sky, first quarter, United Center. Sophie Cunningham broke free on a fast break for what should have been an easy layup. Carrington came flying in from behind her, instead of going for the ball, catching her across the head and neck with enough force to snap her whole body forward. Cunningham hit the floor hard. Cunningham is Indiana's physical, outspoken fan favorite. Carrington is one of the league's most relentless defenders, and White sits right in the middle of both of them, because years before she ever coached the Fever, she was the one coaching Carrington, back when she ran the Connecticut Sun. That connection is exactly why what happened next stung the way it did. Officials reviewed the contact, ejected Carrington, and by the next morning the story wasn't really about the foul anymore. It was about what White said afterward, and it kept building for days, all the way to her walking out to boos from her own crowd before it was finally over. Start with the play itself, because the details matter more than the outrage did. A flagrant 2 foul requires officials to identify 3 specific things: wind-up, impact, and follow-through. This had all 3. It comes with an automatic ejection, a fine, and 2 flagrant points toward a season total that eventually triggers a suspension. Under league rules, once a player reaches 4 or 5 flagrant points, the next flagrant foul of any kind means an automatic 1-game ban, and a second flagrant 2 would mean 2 games gone at once. The broadcast team calling the game live said almost immediately that it looked like a clear flagrant before the refs had even walked over to the replay monitor. What actually complicates the story is that Chicago's own head coach, Tyler Marsh, disagreed with that read in the moment. Watching live from his own bench, he said afterward, he thought Carrington was simply making a play on the ball, not committing a clear flagrant foul. He admitted he hadn't gone back to rewatch it either, which put him in almost the exact same position White would find herself defending days later. When reporters asked him about the social media post Carrington fired off right after her ejection, Marsh said he hadn't even seen it yet and would need to look into it before commenting further. And the foul wasn't even the only officiating headache of that quarter. Caitlin Clark picked up a technical foul of her own soon after, for incidental contact with an official, and because it was her 8th technical of the season, it would have triggered an automatic 1-game suspension of her own. The league reviewed that one too, ruled the contact unintentional, and wiped it off the books before it ever became its own story. One crisis quietly avoided, right in the middle of a much bigger one just getting started. It's worth noting, this isn't even a new dynamic in professional basketball. The same tension has played out for years around Draymond Green and Steve Kerr in the NBA, where a star-level competitor picks up a dangerous flagrant, and the coach has to decide, live, on camera, how much to defend the aggression behind the play versus how clearly to condemn the play itself. Kerr has walked that exact line publicly more than once over the years, and it's never fully satisfied anybody either, no matter which side of it he leaned toward that day. None of that is where the real firestorm started, though. The real firestorm started about 20 minutes later, at the podium. Asked directly about the foul that had just put her own player on the floor, White didn't come out swinging. She came out with context, reminding reporters she'd coached Carrington for years back at the Sun, and that she knew exactly what kind of competitor she was, someone who was never going to let an opponent walk in for an easy bucket. She said she didn't have a problem with the hard foul itself. She said she didn't believe Carrington had gone for Cunningham's neck on purpose. She said the officials made the right call, and that, thankfully, her own player was okay. On paper, none of that sounds especially unreasonable. Said out loud, by the coach of the player who'd just been knocked to the floor, it landed completely differently. The clips were everywhere within the hour, and this wasn't just angry replies in a comment section. WNBA analyst Jason Whitlock said he'd never speak up for White again, calling her response close to unforgivable. Radio host Jerry Callahan asked how it was even possible that Cunningham's own coach was out there defending the player who'd flattened her. Fox Sports personality Dan Dakich went after her on air too, accusing her of failing her own player exactly when it mattered most. And then Stephen A. Smith got involved, and the story stopped being just a WNBA story and became a national one. He tore into White's response on his show, stunned that a head coach would find a way to praise the aggression of the player who just sent her own star crashing to the hardwood, and his question cut through everything else being said that week. How are you the head coach? It became the headline every outlet ran with, the soundbite that outlived the game itself. For a coach already under fire, having the loudest voice in sports media publicly question whether she belonged in the job turned a bad weekend into a full-blown crisis. By the time Tuesday came around, White wasn't just dealing with pundits anymore. She was dealing with her own building. Walking out ahead of Indiana's home game against the New York Liberty, she was met with boos from her own crowd before the ball had even been tipped. She didn't shrink from it. White stepped up before tip-off with a statement that sounded prepared and deliberate, and used it to reframe the entire story. She admitted, for the first time, that she hadn't actually seen a replay of the foul before her original comments, that she'd gone straight from the bench to the podium that night. Once she finally sat down and watched it, her tone changed completely. She called it egregious. She talked about how player safety and player wellness had always been her top priority, and how her relationships with her players meant more to her than any outside noise ever could. Then she turned it back on the people criticizing her, accusing an online community of building a version of her character that simply wasn't true. Indiana went out that night and beat the Liberty, 106-92. Somehow, that wasn't even the headline anymore. What happened in the hours after mattered just as much as anything said at either podium that week. Caitlin Clark didn't hide how the boos made her feel, saying it made her a little sick, to be honest, hearing her own fans turn on her coach like that, and promising her team would keep riding for White no matter what got thrown at them from outside the locker room. Fever president Kelly Krauskopf backed White publicly too, crediting her with keeping the team focused and unified through the brightest spotlight the franchise had ever experienced. But the most telling response of all came from the player who'd actually been hurt. After the win over the Liberty, Cunningham went out of her way to defend her coach, saying their locker room was tight, that everybody had each other's backs, and that White simply hadn't seen the replay before she spoke that first night. She even had kind words left over for Carrington, calling her a hell of a player and a great defender, and pointing out that White had coached her for years and knew exactly what she was capable of, good and bad. As far as Cunningham was concerned, the real problem the whole time was the outside noise trying to turn one hard foul into something that could tear her team apart. Here's the part worth sitting with though. White wasn't dealing with a fringe story. She's the head coach of a team currently sitting first in the Eastern Conference, at 22-12, with the single most watched player in the sport on her roster. That combination guarantees a bigger reaction than almost any other coach in the league would have faced for the exact same words. It also landed inside a season that had already been arguing nonstop about how physical is too physical, with fans and analysts split all year over whether certain matchups were drawing more contact than officials were willing to call. A foul like this one was always going to get read through that lens before a single postgame quote made things worse. 10 years ago, a hard foul in a random August game barely makes it past the local beat writers. This time, it got dissected on ESPN and Fox Sports within hours, by commentators who don't normally cover this league at all. The information hasn't changed. The speed and the size of the audience watching it absolutely has. Here's something almost nobody covering this story actually spent much time on. Minutes after her ejection, Carrington posted 2 words on social media that ended up defining the week more than the foul itself: white privilege. She tagged the Fever directly, no explanation attached. Fans were left to fill in the blanks themselves, and plenty of them did, in every direction imaginable. Days later, after former NFL linebacker Emmanuel Acho publicly criticized her reaction, Carrington fired back, insisting she'd never claimed the foul call itself was about race, and telling her critics to think a little harder before assuming otherwise. What most coverage skipped past entirely is exactly why she felt qualified to say that. Carrington isn't some rookie firing off a random post with nothing behind it. She double majored in psychology and African American studies at Stanford before finishing her college career at Baylor, and she leaned directly on that background in her response, saying she'd never throw around a phrase with that much history behind it, carelessly or without evidence to back it up. She went further, essentially daring her critics to apply the same critical thinking to her that they'd expect from anyone else weighing in on a subject she'd actually spent years formally studying. That doesn't settle what she actually meant by the original 2 words. It does mean she wasn't caught flat-footed defending it days later, and it reframes the whole exchange from a throwaway jab into something she'd clearly already thought through long before anyone asked her to explain it. Here's my actual take on all of it. The loudest critics were right that White's answer sounded bad, and mostly wrong about what it actually revealed about her as a coach. She's got over a decade of receipts as someone who prioritizes player relationships, a Coach of the Year award, a championship won as an assistant, and players across 2 different franchises publicly vouching for her in the exact same week this was unfolding. The real mistake was procedural, not moral. She answered live, straight from the bench, before she'd watched any replay at all. That's a media training problem every coach in every sport eventually runs into, not proof of who she actually is underneath it. Demanding she be fired over one unreviewed answer sets a standard almost no coach could survive. Instant, perfectly worded judgment on a play they hadn't even seen twice yet, delivered under a microscope most coaches never have to face at all. Now, the strongest counter-argument here is a real one, and it deserves more than a dismissal. When player safety is on the line, some critics would say that not having seen the whole replay can't excuse praising the player who caused the injury, intent or not, and that standards shouldn't bend just because of bad timing. I understand that argument, and I'd even go further than that. It's a genuinely reasonable position, not a bad faith one, and plenty of thoughtful fans landed there without needing Stephen A. Smith to tell them to. I'd still push back on it though, because snap judgments made before a full review are exactly how bad calls and worse takes get made in the first place. Taking a day to actually watch a dangerous play before rendering a verdict isn't a player safety failure. It's what should happen before anyone hands down a verdict at all, whether they're coaching the team or just commentating on it from a studio. So where does this actually go from here? A few things I genuinely bet on. First, Carrington doesn't get suspended over this specific foul or the post that followed it. She's still 2 full flagrant points away from the automatic threshold, and the league already handed out its standard fine, with no further discipline announced since. Unless she picks up another dangerous foul in her next handful of games, there's no mechanism under current rules that gets her to a suspension from this alone. Second, White's job isn't in any real danger, not even close. Her front office, her franchise player, and the actual player who got fouled have all publicly backed her within days of the controversy. And front offices don't typically let their president go out of her way to praise a coach's leadership in the middle of a firing conversation. That kind of public support usually means the private conversations are just as supportive. Coaches who are actually on thin ice with ownership don't usually get that kind of full-throated, on-the-record backing from the very people deciding whether they keep their job. And here's the riskier one, the kind you're supposed to actually be wrong about sometimes. I think the next Fever Sky matchup draws a noticeably bigger audience and more pre-game coverage than a typical late-season game between these 2 teams usually would, simply because every storyline from this week is still fresh enough to get replayed in the broadcast open. That next matchup isn't far off either. The Fever and Sky play again on August 23rd in Indianapolis. The rubber match of a season series that's currently tied at 1 game apiece. Chicago taking the first meeting back in June, and Indiana taking this most recent one. Watch for whether Carrington picks up any more flagrant or technical fouls between now and then. She's already added 1 technical since this happened, in a game against the Golden State Valkyries, which doesn't move her toward a flagrant-related suspension, but keeps her temper a live storyline regardless of how the math works out. Watch, too, for how the Fever's home crowd reacts to Carrington walking back into that building for the first time since the ejection, and whether any of that same energy somehow gets redirected toward their own coach after everything that's happened in between. If White's public support really is as solid as it looked this week, that's the building where we'll find out for certain. One post-game answer, given before anyone had actually seen a replay, turned into the biggest story in the WNBA for the better part of a week. And if you actually look past the headlines instead of just skimming them, almost everyone involved handled the aftermath better than they got credit for in the moment. A coach owned an honest mistake instead of hiding from it once she'd actually seen the tape. A teammate who'd been hurt chose to publicly defend her coach instead of piling on with everyone else. A player used a controversial 2-word post as a reason to explain herself in detail instead of quietly walking it back. None of that needed a hidden scandal or a secret to be worth watching. It just needed real people having a genuinely complicated week in front of an audience bigger than any of them expected, and mostly choosing not to take the easy way out of it. Whatever you think of how any one of them handled it, that's a lot more interesting than a clean villain and a clean hero. And it's probably closer to how most real weeks in professional sports actually go.